Aloha, friends and family. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Embodied Healing Self. Today, I have one of my dear friends that I met in one of our masterminds, and she is a psycho-spiritual mentor and a psychotherapist and a yoga teacher, and so much more than just that. The moment that I really realized I wanted to connect with her was when we were in an event together, and there was a song that came on called "The Dog Days Are Over." I don't know if you remember this moment. And we just started dancing it out. We're just like, hell yeah, dog days are over. And if you guys know me, you know that I love to dance. I love to dance. So when I'm sitting next to this girl and we get up and we're just like rocking out to this song, I was like, okay, we're going to go have lunch together. And then we're like, yeah, we're going to go to this healthy food place. And I'm like, all right. So I got to know Valerie a little bit more, and I just knew that there was going to be a time that we would connect on the show, but I just didn't know what it was going to be about. So a couple of weeks ago, she sends out an email talking about spiritual trauma. And I was like, oh, this is it. I could feel it in my gut. I talk about intuition on the show all the time, and this is one of those moments, because we are in a time of collective spiritual trauma and awakening right now. And what's happening in the collective is really a reflection of what's happening within us. So today's intention, and we'll see where it goes, because this woman has so much knowledge, I really don't know where we're going to go, but the intention is to really invite you all into the conversation around that intersection of the collective healing that is happening and the reflection of our relationship with our own spirituality, really, and what can show up, what we're using the word spiritual trauma, what that means, what it looks like, how it has potentially showed up in my life, in her life, in your life as the listeners, to give you some insight and permission to just be present and allow yourself to just listen to the wisdom and open up to receive the possibility of what you might be willing to move through. So Valerie, thank you so much for being on the show today. And yeah, I just want to say welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. And I do think it's really cool that this is what we're connecting over. And I just really appreciate how you have stayed connected with me, because I think we have differences, but we're also kindred spirits. So I know that this conversation will just flow and that some truth is going to be dropped.
Truth bombs are going to be dropped today, yes, for sure. So I'm feeling really called to just invite you to share maybe just a couple of interesting things about yourself, like what you like to do, or there's this side of you that is really interesting, and it's what kind of drawed me near to you, closer to you. So I'm just like, there are just a couple of like interesting kind of quirky facts that you would be willing to share about yourself.
Sure. I joke that I'm a literal tree hugger, because there is nothing more grounding to me than putting my hands on trees. So feet on earth, hands on trees. Trees are like my sort of primary image when I think of my spirituality. I identify as pagan and druid and Unitarian Universalist and like all of these intersecting faiths. And as someone who didn't grow up thinking I would be a church-going human, it's kind of funny. And then otherwise, I love Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the Buffyverse. I was very sad when my New York City Buffy prom got canceled this year. I was looking forward to it. And it's funny, I'm torn on this because I don't want to hide myself. But normally when I'm not working at home and on video all the time with my clients, I have a bunch of Beanie Boos that sit on my bookshelves with their little sparkly eyes, and there's like a dragon and a turtle and a unicorn and all these. So they're resting in the closet now. But I don't have any children, but I really do truly identify as a child at heart, with, of course, some mature sides too. But yeah, we have to play.
Yeah. 100% we have to play. And I'm very, very, very familiar with Beanie Boos. In fact, it might be the time that we are finally allowing those to find another home. But the funny thing is they've been a part of our house for, probably 8 or 9 years. And if I were to really think about it, there's thousands and thousands of dollars that have gone into honeydews, for sure. I mean, we had families of turtles and families of raccoons and
oh my God.
like family. So yeah, but they're so cute with their big eyes.
I'm just saying, if you got any gems in there, send them my way.
Well, and most of them, because we had so many, it was like every birthday, like every everything, like, and every time we go on a trip, they're in the airport. But it's like a lot of them are surprisingly pretty clean and brand new, because if you got 5 of them, you don't snuggle one all the time. So yeah, we talked about that when we got on. I'm like, where are your little magical creatures? But they're very distracting. I will admit, like I'm looking at them, when we speak. So you guys, the reason I wanted to have her on the show is because she's a trained psychotherapist and a spiritual mentor. She's a yoga teacher. And there's so much value in that alone. Like, we haven't even started talking about like the way that she grew up and how she became, interested in just the combination of the two anyway. But if you just hear that together, I believe in my heart, and I know what's true for me, like this is a really solid path for the future of healing, to be able to combine those two together, because there's a time and a place for both of those, and in each of the skill set that comes in with, the spiritual aspect and the psychotherapist aspect. Now, I'm not a trained psychotherapist. I have the, life coaching and meditation teacher, yoga teacher aspect, but to be able to have those skills together and to blend them is something that I see is so valuable for so many of us. So I want to ask you, before we do start on this conversation of spiritual trauma, because I'm sensing that, there's a reason that you got into psychotherapy and into yoga teacher training. Like tell me a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are.
Yeah. So on the surface level, it was like nothing too dramatic. I had a fairly stable upbringing, even though my parents divorced when I was young. They co-parented really well. But there were things that, under the surface that we don't discover until we're in therapy years later, that were kind of driving the eating disorder stuff that started to emerge for me in high school and got pretty severe, and into college. And then also my senior year of high school, my cousin, who was 2 years younger than me, she completed suicide, and we were really close. So those two things together, and then being fortunate enough to get into recovery for my eating disorder and actually developing a positive relationship with my body and food that I never thought was going to be possible. I worked in marketing for a few years after college, and then I was like, yeah, this isn't it. So that's when I went to grad school, and originally went into work with eating disorders, and then quickly in residential treatment got a crash course in addiction and all kinds of other mental health things and trauma, and especially growing up in the Bible Belt and now being like in the belt buckle of the Bible Belt in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. There's so much. And also my mom was a victim of ministerial misconduct, pastoral abuse. And so finding my own spiritual path has been an aspect of that. And then working with people who have either like thrown the baby out with the bathwater in their own kind of experiences with really controlling or shaming religious experiences, or just not even knowing where to explore. Like, well, if traditional religion isn't it, like, I don't even know what there is for me. So that was a little weaving around, but that's kind of how I got to where I am.
Yeah, I love that. And as I heard you speaking, one thing that really rang true for me is you shared your personal experience of healing through your eating disorder by connecting with your relationship to food in your body. So mm-hmm. healing that relationship. And so what I'm noticing here, because it is all about the co-creation, the relationship that we have, like there's an invitation here to heal the relationship with spirit, with whatever mm-hmm. that is for people. And so my background, just to kind of give everybody the big picture to see where this takes us, is raised Catholic. And so it's so interesting. I've been married for 17 years and I've been with my husband for 20 years. And like, like my grandmother didn't come to my wedding because it was on a beach. It wasn't in a church. And my husband's always like, you always say that your family's like religious, but like you're way more connected than like, and I just started to realize like, I loved the ritual of going to church. I loved, that idea of something like that. But I always knew, even from the time, because I have a brother who's gay, and like, that's not a sin, like God made him that way. So from a very young age, I can remember thinking like, well, I like this stuff, but not all of it is totally completely true for me. And like my spirituality, my relationship, my connection to source, to God, to the divinity within me is just, it's like this knowing. For me, it's always been a knowing that I've always known, and I didn't need to be validated by whatever I was hearing on Sunday morning, or I mean, sometimes I wasn't, that was nice, but it was, and that was just my relationship. And there was no need to label it Catholic or whatever, and I know that in my personal spiritual practice now that I have a connection with, certain, I guess, energies. And I also know that, I look at each person in my family and theirs are a little bit different, and that's okay too. So let's just talk about what spiritual trauma is really. Let's just go straight there, because some people are probably wondering like, well, what is that? Does it mean if I, believe in God, I'm bad, or if I don't, if I'm Buddhist, what does that mean to you? And how does it show up in the world around you? Like, how are you seeing this, even with, I know there's confidentiality, but just in the people that you work with, just in general, in the energy, what is it to you and how do you see it?
Yeah, so spiritual abuse or spiritual trauma can show up in so many different ways. It's very complex and multi-layered. But one of the things about it, just like any other kind of trauma, it's like there's the really overt stuff where it's like, okay, everything the Catholic Church and Catholic Church is not alone, but has gone through with the scandal around sexual misconduct of of the clergy. So that's huge. And it's, even that is nuanced, because it's like, well, what defines sexual misconduct? If there's a youth pastor who is, starts to rub the shoulders of the 13-year-old girl who's in his care and sits close to her and puts his hand up, there doesn't have to be like an exchange of fluids for sexual trauma to occur in that power dynamic. So I think that there's so many layers of that trauma that are more kind of covert. So people don't even realize sometimes that they've experienced spiritual trauma. And that's just on kind of like the more sexual angle, but anything around abuse of power, because there is even if the minister is a lovely person or whatever, the clergy person, there is a power differential. So even that's where it's just like with Me Too, it's hard to say like, oh, well, it was consensual, but was it really? Because this person was in the position of power. So I wanted to share, this is a wordy definition, but I think it's really good and will kind of give us some other jumping off points. And this comes from a book by William Hobson, Defining Spiritual Abuse. This touches more on the angle of from a clergy member, but we'll talk about other kinds too. So he says, spiritual abuse is the gross dereliction or neglect of a spiritual leader's responsibility to protect the basic rights of anyone under that leader's care. These basic rights include, by the leader, of parishioners' spiritual, psychological, financial, and physical well-being. Spiritual abuse occurs when any spiritual leader violates these sacred trusts in any way, form, or fashion, thus causing harm in any regards to the aforementioned rights. And I could go on, but so you can see that it's very broad. And then even things like parents who are really religious and raise their children that way. And like, I'm not a parent and I'm not here to tell anyone how to raise their kids, but I have seen so many times the result of that being when religion is interpreted in a way that is about hellfire and brimstone, shaming, controlling, sin, all of those things, the child often develops a very shame-based view of themselves and the world, and all kinds of negative core beliefs about themselves get kind of locked in. So that even in their adult life, like I worked with a lot of people who are like brilliant women, and they're like, I know that my body is not shameful. I know my sexuality is not shameful. But it's so ingrained that it's hard for me to enjoy sex with my partner or whatever. So that's just one example. But yeah, that control, and even like parents who are so dedicated to their missionary work or their pastoral work that they're not really making that direct emotional connection with their own kids. So that's another way that I see it.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So as I hear you speaking of, just a couple of different ways, what I'm really noticing is that there's like, it feels to me that the trauma is just in the broken trust. It's like there's something within us that is trusting a parent, a person, a mentor, a leader, or something to guide us to our own divinity, if it were in that space, right? And that, and somehow that gets broken, and it's not usually intentionally, right? Like, especially I can speak from a parent, like we're always doing the best that we can do. Like we have really good intentions, and then something happens where, as a child, we perceive we're not good enough because we're not living up to. And although I see the value that it provides to have these sort of guidelines or morals to live by, right? Like, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't cheat, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't commit adultery. Like, those are really good moral principles to live by. I totally get it. And then the deeper part of that comes when there's that point in time, and this I have witnessed. I have witnessed around me is, when as adults, women start to, particularly, I guess in how it showed up in my life through just conversations with friends, is like there almost becomes a resistance. Then it's like a resistance to then everything, because if I was made bad in this space of my church or whatever, then some people go through complete, well, I don't want to have anything to do with it, I'm just going to resist it, I'm going to find myself type of thing. And so to me, it really feels like there's kind of a broken trust, whether they came from somewhere. And how do you see, from the space that you've been in, that you've held for people? Because really the point of this show is to help people to recognize it and to move through it and to seek support. So what are some of the ways? Let's just start with, we shared a couple ways that it can show up. From an outer perspective, what are some of the feelings that we might feel internally if this may have been, like, we're not trying to create something that wasn't there, but if there's a feeling that we can resonate with around, because what's happening on the collective level is people are being called to really step into their own connection to source right now, like their own spirituality. And the only way that we can do this is to become aware of why we thought we were disconnected, right? Because we're never really disconnected. We just perceive that we are. So what are the ways that we might be feeling if this has been a block for us, this spiritual trauma?
Yeah, great question. So I think one is, certainly you kind of identified this, but if we feel a lot of activation or anger when spiritual topics come up or when religion comes up, and it's not to say that a person shouldn't feel that. It's more just like, that's a phase in the process. You don't want to camp out and stay in that phase forever, hopefully. But because that's an experience a lot of people I know have, is when they find themselves around people who might identify as like a certain kind of Christian or whatever, they notice that like somatic, like kind of stomach in your throat feeling, or anger, like heat in your face, and just like wanting to either lash out or get out. So that kind of activation, I would say, is one for sure. And then you mentioned I loved how you said that we're never actually disconnected, but we perceive we are. And when we've sort of allowed, I kind of picture like the flame internally, and it's still going, but it's so small. It's so covered up by all this gunk and all these layers of things that we feel kind of like a little bit of deadness inside. You know, we don't feel our true vitality and aliveness, because you asked me before we started, this is a slight sidebar about eco psychology, and it's really, it goes beyond, it's not just like, oh, go take a walk in the woods, which is great, we need that, we are nature, we are animal, but it's really about being alive in a world that's fully alive. And that animism, like that is life force, that is God's source, whatever you want to call it. And when we don't, when our light is dialed down so low that we don't sense that interconnectedness, then we might just think that we're depressed. And I'm not saying that like all depression is a result of disconnection from source and that's the only thing you need to fix and you don't need to explore medication, but we might very much feel that we're depressed. And if we just treat it with some kind of medication rather than addressing like the fact that we don't feel like a live human, we're going to miss the mark, and we might feel a little bit of symptom relief, but not much is going to change. So I'm trying to think of any other
I would say
symptoms.
even just the word. I would just say even the word God triggers people. Like that,
Absolutely.
like we can just start there.
Yeah.
Okay? Like we can just stop right now.
It's funny because that you say that, because I mentioned I'm also Unitarian Universalist, and in our church, which is, there's no specific dogma or creed. There's like we agree on these covenants of like seeing the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and respecting the interdependent web that we're all part of and things like that. But it's really exploring your own individual search for truth and meaning. And so we have a lot of people worldwide who come to us after their religious trauma experience, once they're willing to maybe explore as a part of that healing some other spiritual path. And so it's kind of funny because we joke about it, but UUs can be a little allergic to the word God because of that, because there's been so much wounding. So it's like, we'll use all of these other fancy words, right?
Yeah.
And I know like Karen Kenny, who we both love, she talks about this. She's like, I don't care, call it God, call it whatever the hell you want to call it. So it doesn't really matter. But yeah, if you get activated by that word, it's not wrong, but it does indicate that there's stuff there for you to continue to uncover and resolve.
Yeah, I'd say that's an invitation, or the trigger is the activation, the invitation.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good stuff in that right there. I was actually just talking to my teenage daughter about this yesterday. Like we talk about everything, but just in the noticing for us, what we were talking about specifically is I have a dear friend who's French and calls herself atheistic, atheist. Not atheistic. Is that a word? Did I just make up a word?
Yeah, they're both words.
Oh, it is a word. Okay.
Yeah.
And, she's super connected to nature. And I'm just like, it's really just the word that's triggering her.
Totally.
Like, if you believe in something greater than you, then we're really all saying the same thing. Like, we're really talking about this knowing that we're not just physical flesh. Like, if you care about the mama bird who's, has 3 baby eggs right now, and you have like empathy and love for that mama bird that's outside your window, that is your connection right there, because you're connected to something greater than you. You're connected to this larger, like you said, integrated network of what I like to call just love, really is what it is. So, I think that's another invitation there, is just noticing, how you feel in certain conversations and in the words too. And the other thing that came through from you as you were speaking that comes up in my sessions around subconscious work is we do some and there's a feeling for many
Oh no, you froze on me. I don't know if you can still hear me. but you're frozen and I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I paused it for a
Cool.
second.
Okay.
We just got disconnected for a second.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's actually, when we peel layers, I often find that there is this belief, again, getting back to the belief that we're disconnected. It can show up as we feel like we've been abandoned by God or universal source, whatever word resonates with you. I find that the word God is the one that triggers people. Mm-hmm. And so there's a feeling of abandonment that often shows up in people. I'm just curious, from your perspective, when you hear that, what do you notice around that for people? Do you see that? We talked about the disconnection, the perceived disconnection. So if we're perceiving, this, because I think that's where we're starting to, it'll lead us into how do we move through this, right? Because we begin to realize that in some ways, I think that what happens on a personal level is that we have given our own personal power away. We entrusted people outside of us to give us some answers, to save us, to whatever. And at some point in time, there's a realization that if that person breaks that trust because we gave our power away, and maybe it's because we're kids and that's what we do anyway, because of course we trust the people we look up to, but there's something there around this sort of, like you called it, the flame. In my words, it's like the fall from grace, where we perceive that we're separate, we perceive that we're disconnected, which is really the trauma that I would say I see, is the perception that we are disconnected and separate. Do you see that in the work that you do, sort of that disconnection, that abandonment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like one of the biggest things talking about the illusion of separation is just how big all the ego stuff is. And like, we know from a psychological perspective, yes, we all have an ego. There's not anything wrong with it. It's what makes me know that I'm Valerie and I have the history that I've had and I have things that I like and things that I dislike. That sense of ego is fine. It's part of being a human. But when we get so over identified with our individuality and so invested in like what other people think of me, that's when we're so separate and we're miserable when we're in that space. So I talk about like, get into your spiritual helicopter. When you go up really high and you look at the situation from that angle, it's totally different from being on the ground in ego view, because we can actually experience that universality. And when you talk about abandonment, it's funny because I kind of picture that showing up in two different ways. So one is for people who maybe they've experienced some trauma, whether it's spiritual variety or otherwise, and they feel like they're being punished by God or abandoned by God. And that breaks my heart, because I think it highlights the misinterpretation, and this is my personal bias coming through, of what God is, like as though there's this like interventionist God that's pulling all the puppet strings and like waiting for you to make your shopping list and beam it up in the form of prayer. And like, I believe in things like, if I am setting my intention for something, I am more likely to create that in my life, sure. But I don't think it's because there's this like puppet master pulling strings, making something happen in my life. Because when I think about like two kids in a cancer ward, one of them dies and one of them doesn't, I don't think it's because one family prayed harder. I think it's more complicated than that. So I think if there's a belief still in this sort of God, then it can be damaging and people can feel really abandoned. But a lot of times when people start to do their own kind of reckoning with whatever they were handed in terms of family of origin, spiritual beliefs, religious stuff, then it's like they feel abandoned by everything. They're like, well, I thought I knew and understood how the world worked, and I thought I knew how to be good and get to heaven and like what to avoid, and that felt like soothing in a way. But now that I'm doing all this questioning, if they're even in a space where they're allowed and encouraged to do questioning, then they start to feel like, I don't even know what to make of anything anymore. It's like kind of an existential crisis. So that's another piece. And it's not a bad place to be. It's kind of one of those dark nights of the soul that indicates that you are doing that kind of deeper level expansion. And you have that opportunity then to create a more authentic connection with that source.
Yeah, and as I'm listening to you speak, what's coming through for me now that I notice, because I'm having this conversation to also be curious about how it's showing up in my life too, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm reading another book on Mary Magdalene right now, the one by Megan Watterson. I've read a couple of her books. I've been to her cave. I went there 5 years ago. And I really live more and connect with Christianity, but also very open to everyone else. Like, I don't think that I'm better than anybody. I don't think that anybody is right or wrong. I just know that I resonate with, just some of that energy, and mostly because of Mary Magdalene. And so, this is starting to bring up a lot for me. And I was, again, talking to my teenage daughter about this, like thinking about where we are collectively right now, thinking about the racism that we're dealing with, the patriarchal society that we still live in, and noticing, I can't help but notice, right? Like, I have been accepting my whole life that I believed that Jesus was a white guy. And there haven't been that many super, I guess, I don't know what the word is, but like influential female people within the church that I know about, like, that have ever made, I mean, yes, okay, we all know Mother Teresa but I'm just saying, like, if you really look around, and then, my daughter, a couple years ago, one of her best friends was Black, and she went to her house and they had a Black Jesus on the wall. It's like, well, of course, like, I mean, who even knows what he really looks like, right? That's what I'm noticing right now is potentially another wound in our culture and in our world, is what we have even just perceived these, and I'm speaking about Christianity right now, and I don't know how it shows up in other religions really, but because it's not my area of expertise, but what we have perceived in general, the energy truthfully has been male energy in religion. And I'm curious, like, what that brings up for you is specifically around where we are right now in this point in time. Like, we're July 2020. It's been a crazy year, pandemic, Black Lives Matter. We've got an election year coming up. Like, this is bringing up everything pretty much. So with the people listening, like, there are people that, as I say this, they're probably noticing that they have felt the same way. What comes up for you as I speak to that? Like, where do you see us now, and where do you see us going? And what is something that could be maybe like words of wisdom to support people moving forward in that way?
Yeah, wow, there's so much there. We are in a true moment of reckoning. And it's like, you often hear it talked about, like, well, Black folks have been living this their entire life. This is not new. And neither is it new for most of us who've had our eyes open to any degree. But in a conversation I was having yesterday, my friend said it this way, and I loved it. It's like, some of this stuff that's been happening recently, it's like, I already cared, but I got activated at a new level, in a good way, of like, oh shit, we better do something, because it just highlighted the extent to which, despite how we think we're so progressed in our society, and like, look at where we are with like gay marriage being legal, and we're, we have women in positions of power, and we had a Black president, and all these things, like, sure, we can look at those as measures of progress, but there is still so much, like you said, oppressive patriarchy and colonized culture and white supremacy, and freedom is liberation. And spiritual truth is liberation. So if we are not liberating all of us, none of us are liberated. So it's the lack of females being welcome in traditional religious leadership, in like the Protestant tradition, even just Judeo-Christian traditions, is really devastating, and I think has made women feel like we're just on the sidelines for centuries and millennia. And so to be having this moment of reckoning and saying that we have to heal by taking a decolonial perspective, and that is, it doesn't even have to be matrilineal or like matriarchal, but it's inviting power together and shared power, and things like nobody owns the land. We're settling on the land. The land is stolen from the people who settled there first. So there's a lot of ways that we can engage in decolonizing work, both internally. So it's like exploring our own implicit biases, doing all the work of like, in the excellent book, Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad, things like that. But even like engaging in healing modalities and community connective modalities of things like embodiment, right? Embodying in any capacity, whether it's creating something with your hands or dancing or sculpting or whatever that might be, lovemaking, that these modalities that have been in a like Western medical model, patriarchal society that have been suppressed. So anytime that we're allowing ourselves to engage in those dream work and trance dance and all these things, it's like that is resistance. And it's not enough to like just say, oh, I went and did this like vision quest by myself, and so now I'm, now I'm healing the world. Like we have to engage at that individual level, and then we come back and say, okay, now I'm going to engage in a political way, or I'm going to engage in volunteering with this climate organization.
Yeah, as I hear you share, and this message has come through on so many of my podcasts, it's not just doing, it's like being. You can't just say something, you have to embody it, you have to be it, you have to like just be it, whatever you're sharing. And I love that you said spiritual truth is liberation, and we aren't liberated unless everyone is liberated, because that applies to everything. That applies to everything. It applies to racism, and it applies to, what we're talking about, the patriarchal society, all of that. It applies to all of it. And what I'm noticing as you speak is and thank you for saying the embodiment is so important, because of course that's what I believe. That's why the podcast is called Embodied Healing Self, because that is really the purpose of the human condition to me, is to embody that spiritual truth. And so when we do that, we become that. We no longer see it as separate from us. It's no longer the perception that it is separate, that we are separate from God, from anybody, from anything. And it's more of a Unitarian, universal, integrative approach. And that is what we're agreeing, from what you shared and what I heard you say, is like, that is the path forward, is really the ability to be inclusive, like to not try to make somebody wrong actually, but to, I mean, there's a fine line there, right? Like, and so that's what's coming up for me right now, is there's a fine line between like accountability, right? And not making others wrong to the point where we're excluding them.
Right. The whole cancel culture thing.
Right. So how do we do that? Because it's in spirituality as a result of spiritual trauma, and it's being reflected right now. Right now, there's the people that want to wear masks and the people that don't want to wear masks, right? There's the people, Black Lives Matter, and there's the people like Blue Lives Matter. Like it feels like people want you to be on one side or the other. Hey, there's Republicans and Democrats. Like it's just, right? Like it's everywhere. There's you're either one way or the other. How do we move forward? What is the healthy way in, creating change from a place of creating change in systems that are no longer serving us and keeping people accountable, but also having that inclusive, integrative truth moving forward that we are not liberated unless everybody is liberated. What? Because I don't know the answer to me starts with, within. That's where the work is. But like, really, how do we continue to move the needle on that?
Yeah, well, and it's the $1 billion question right now, right? And not even just right now, but it's like we just continue to reach what feels like more and more of a climax of this false dichotomy, like you said, of you're either way over here, you're over here. There was an excellent piece you might want to put in the show notes by I can't remember his last name, Matt, who does the Oatmeal comics. It just came out the other day, and it's such a brilliant engaging walkthrough on like why we believe what we believe, and how it's amazing because we are emotional creatures. We're not just rational creatures. So there's actually a thing called the backfire effect that shows the more evidence that you have to support like whatever opposing belief, the more you will refute it. So it's like someone gives me, if I don't think I should have to wear a mask and someone sends me 10 pieces of data about why wearing a mask works, I'm going to be even more strong in my opinion against. I mean, isn't that nuts, right? But it's part of how we work. So I think we have to look at things like, we have to figure out how to truly listen to each other and not just immediately get so blinded by our frustration and like, oh my God, how is this person such an idiot kind of thing that we can't even hear them. Because I'm not an expert in nonviolent communication, the modality from Marshall Rosenberg, but basically it's like looking at in any conflict, each party has feelings and needs, and the better that we can express our own feelings and needs and try to either elicit or even just imagine, like even if it's someone like, the president of the United States, and I can't be in direct communication with him, but I can imagine what his feelings and needs are. And I don't have to agree with the behavior. And I can feel angry, but at the end of the day, we all are acting out of our own feelings and perceived needs, and perceived threats. So being able to truly listen from the heart, speak from the heart, and not get so caught up in needing to be right that we actually miss an opportunity to make a connection.
Yeah, I actually love when somebody shows me that I was wrong, because it means I learned something. And that's a huge win for me because I wasn't always like that. And, you're really speaking about some super valuable stuff right here. I've read nonviolent communication as well. And just the ability to even recognize the way that we speak to people without the need to be heard and without the need to be right. And even in the words that we use, like if we find ourselves saying like, you this, you that, well, we don't really know. We're just like, we're projecting. And oftentimes we're projecting what we're actually feeling and experiencing.
Oh yeah.
So and I just had this conversation yesterday with one of my clients, just about how to manage her employees. And it's really just getting back to, we actually have to be willing and open to be interested in what the other person has to say. And that's really where it begins. And we can only do that really when we do the self-work to know that it's safe for us to even be wrong. It's safe for us to not be understood. That's really, that's a big one for me, is like, and I see this come up for me, is like the need to be understood, because the truth is people can only meet you where they are. So, you may not be understood because you have two different perspectives in the first place. So really allowing those conversations to open up, like you said, I love, without the need to be right. Because then we get into duality again. If we have right and wrong, well, what about all of that in between? Like if we're so attached to being right, we're totally missing the other perspective. So I hope, and that even comes full circle back around to religion and spirituality, because I know that there are people listening to this show who are struggling with this. I know there are people that are struggling with this. They're remembering their religious upbringing and feeling guilt and shame around what they know is true for them in this moment. Like just knowing that they are actually connected, but then feeling, and I went through this when I did my yoga teacher training back in 2014. I was like, I feel like I'm cheating on God because yoga is not really Christian, or the way that I was learning, and it wasn't right. That was when I was doing a lot of my work around, spiritual trauma, was actually in my yoga teacher training. And then realizing that it was all actually the same. It was just connecting and being expressed in my body. So what are some tools that could be helpful for people right now? Because we've given the big picture of we're in a place where we're being activated to seek to allow that spiritual truth to be liberated in our own spiritual truth, individually and collectively. That's what's happening right now. And we're being challenged with our own physical health. Do we feel safe in our body? Can we trust the system? With racism, with the police force, with it's just going to continue to escalate as the elections are around the corner. And what are some tools, because this isn't over yet, we're still in this, that people can use that you use as well? I know that you also do somatic breath work and mindfulness and things like that. What are some tools that people can start to maybe educate themselves on, or seek a person who can help them in that way if they're really feeling disconnected and uncertain right now, or they're feeling triggered, or they're feeling shame or anger, not only in their own spirituality, but in their connection to just what's happening in the world right now?
Yeah. Well, I'll say, like, first thing, just umbrella, kind of like we talked about a little bit earlier, is any way that you can get in your body and feel alive and embodied and start to create safety within yourself and connection to self, like, that is doing the work. So there's a million different ways. And what I love about that is that you might hear of, like, oh, well, my friend is doing this like really complex breath practice or breath work kind of thing. And I feel like I should do that. Well, maybe you could try it, but you don't have to love it if you love something else. So it's finding what feels good for you. But we really have to take care of our nervous systems, like, all the time, but everything is just dialed up right now. So having an understanding of, like, as one of my mentors, Anna Dea Judith, talks about, your energetic charge, and looking at, like, when am I kind of depleted and I need to charge up? So if I'm feeling that, like, overwhelm, paralysis, and I'm just kind of like a blob on the couch, I need to charge. And so maybe I'll stand up and do 10 squats, and that's going to get me to a regulated place a lot quicker than it is me trying to think my way into a different state. If I need to discharge energy because I'm, like, hyper aroused in my nervous system and I'm on edge and I'm an anxious ball of energy, then I need to shake. I need to stomp out. I need to, like, whatever my ways are of discharging, and really thinking of, like, discharging energy comes through our what are these called? Our limbs, whatever the end points of the body. So, like, the hands, the feet, the head. So whatever we need to release to kind of discharge some of that energy. And then I think of, too, like, the importance of whether you want to get involved in, like, an NVC practice group, or even just practice loving kindness meditation. We need that so much right now. And I am speaking for myself, certainly, because I get very frustrated. I used to say when I was younger, I'm tolerant of everything except intolerance. But then that just takes us back to the dichotomy again. And I can be like, well, I like people who are willing to be loving and accepting. But if people, like, Westboro Baptist Church is an extreme example, but there are a lot of, religious institutions or people that are judging, shaming, not loving everybody, being intolerant. And I want to be mad at them and I want to hate them. And that's not serving anyone. So I can advocate and invite change and question and challenge those things. But also I need to learn how to hold love for those people as humans, as fellow sisters, brothers, cousins, even while I am challenging those institutions. So that loving kindness meditation, and you can find, like, 5-minute versions of recorded practices. You can find an hour-long loving kindness meditation, but will really coach you in being able to hold that kind of at first dissonant feeling of like, okay, picture that person that's very difficult for you to feel positive toward, and send them love. May you be at peace. May you be free of suffering. And that is, man, that is one of the practices we need the most right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good one. I've participated in all of those, and it's part of what I teach in my group coaching too. Just offering ways like movement and meditations, because, like you said, there's another like idea in our culture that meditation or even prayer has to be look a certain way, and it's not. Sometimes it's walking the dog, sometimes it's journaling, sometimes it's active meditation, sometimes it's kundalini, sometimes it's dynamic meditation, the shaking and all that, and sometimes it's dance, sometimes it's the way that you choose to prepare your meal or eat your food. Like, it's really more the connection, which is where we started this whole conversation, the relationship with self and spirit, like us in wholeness with those parts together in the larger picture of what's happening, like just seeing ourselves connected to our own experience personally. And then, like, this conversation is not about us. This conversation is for everybody who's listening and what they can take away from it. And of course, I am totally in alignment with the whole embodiment thing. And I love that you brought up Anna Day Judith, and she wrote Wheels of Life, and is a teacher of the chakras, which is a lot of what I teach. In fact, my entire private coaching program was based on through the chakra system. And so I do an energize and align challenge. And you talked about like noticing your energy field. I just taught a class on this last week. The energy body is what holds the physical, mental, emotional, astral bodies. That is actually who we are. And so, there are different things that can throw our energy off, our emotions, the food we eat, even this virus is a frequency, right? Like, everything is a frequency that can alter our energy field. And so when we become really aware of like what is in alignment with our energy field, then we become healthier and stronger in those different practices, emotionally, mentally, physically. Mm-hmm. So I really love that you brought it back down into the embodiment of it, and allowing the body to be a tool where we can move that energy through us. My clients laugh at me, but I encourage anger burns. Like, in our house, we have punching gloves. I've got 2 daughters. I grew up, thinking there was shame around anger. I want them to be able to, if they feel it, express it in a healthy way. I think that it's totally natural for us to feel emotions and be given permission to express them in a way that's healthy, so that we don't project them onto other people through our words, emotional vomiting, horrible stuff on Facebook and things like that. If we can take accountability and give ourselves permission to feel what we need to feel, we can transmute that energy.
Yeah. And there's a couple of things that I want to add too, just around like community. Yes. And also knowing that it's okay to ask for help. So with the community piece, and that's something that I really am challenging myself to work on right now, because obviously community looks very different this year. But I can tend to be a major like hermit homebody kind of person, and I like my individual friend connections, but I really have benefited a lot from experiences that I've had in coming together in community, whether that's your local, like pockets of your local community, or online community of people who are on a similar kind of healing path, or whatever kind of community. One of them right now is I started a caucus or affinity group of other white women, so that we can do our work, including the ugly parts of it that our friends of color don't need to be burdened with, and come and translate that work into activism and change in the world, and also doing the internal stuff. So being able to have those deep conversations in community. And then the asking for help part, it's an interesting dialectic, because on one hand, like we're saying, and both are true, we're saying like, you are ultimately the divine, you are your teacher, right? And any good guru, teacher, leader, therapist, coach, whatever, is leading you back to your inner wisdom and inner divine. However, sometimes we need help in uncovering all of the crap.
100%.
And yeah, and like with trauma, especially, sometimes doing modalities like EMDR or hypnosis or whatever other things that we need to kind of bridge that head-heart connection. Because it's like, well, I know I'm worthy here, but all that crap from my past keeps me from believing it here. So doing whatever somatic work and therapeutic work we need to really move that stuff through. So yeah, so that it's, yes, you are ultimately your own teacher, but it's also okay to have guides along the way.
Yep. And I think that that is the perfect place to sort of put the bow on the package. It's interesting, quite a few of my recent podcast interviews ended with just that message. And I think that's what we're seeing right now this year is like, we have an opportunity to choose to allow ourselves to connect with people who can support us right now. And most people, when they feel a lot of people are feeling uncertain and some people are feeling defeated right now. It's the perfect time to really realize the value of community and tribe. And not in just the support, but there's a lot of power in being seen and witnessed in our experience as well, which I think, and I know I have a group coaching program as well, where we do this. We connect every 2 weeks via Zoom, and we do the same thing. And, we've been able to have those extremely uncomfortable conversations about what's happening, to be seen and witnessed and held without judgment. Particularly I work with women, particularly for women to be able to have that space where they will not be judged or gossiped about, because we have group agreements in the very beginning that this is the space, this is sacred space. I have been a part of many groups over the past 3 years. And I would say that for me personally, we can do personal work all day, but it's the doing and the being. When we actually step outside of our comfort zone and allow ourselves to be seen and witnessed in our vulnerability, in our shadows, in our beliefs, we ask for support. Help me to see where I might have underlying racism. Help me to see where I might be judgmental of other people. There is so much like space for transformation and growth and healing in that. And I really believe that that's, where we're at a place where we get to choose to allow that to happen for us. So it is true. It's like the moon cycle. It's like the tide. It's the ebb and the flow. Sometimes we go in, I call it the balance of being and becoming. Sometimes we're in the being, and then we step out into our circle of trust. I always think of, what was that, Meet the Parents? Do you remember that circle of trust?
Yeah.
We find a circle of trust, and then we become in the becoming, and then we integrate into our being again, and then we step out, we grow and expand in our circles of trust. So thank you for all of that. I want to share with the listeners what community offerings you have, where people might be able to find, if they really resonate with your message. What can you share with us what you're offering right now?
Yeah, thank you. So a couple things that I'm sure you'll probably mention this at the beginning, so I'll keep it brief, are just my podcasts. So check out the podcasts wherever you listen. And I am right now, I'm not sure when this is going to air.
I know you have it's probably going to be in about 3 weeks, which I think is after.
Okay. So I will probably be running this program again. By the time this airs, it will be in the middle of running for the first time, but I will probably run it again. And it's called What the F is Happening. And just really about a lot of the things we've talked about, and the tools for regulation and having hard conversations and witnessing each other through that process. So that is one offering. And then my new free offering is called From Comparison to Confidence, because those are issues that so many of us deal with in terms of comparing ourselves to other people and like feeling like confidence is this elusive thing that we're never going to have or reach. So it's a 3-part video series, and I'm sure that will be linked wherever you are listening to this. Yeah.
Yes. Awesome. And yeah, I know that right now for your current offering, you're also offering people to be able to choose their own experience, which I think is really awesome, for them to choose like the price and the experience that works for them. So, because I know that there are people that are really that are struggling in that area right now. Like they need the support and they don't know how they're going to make it happen. So,
right. And
yeah.
especially, I really want to be able to open up with this offering and future offerings, just as part of decolonizing and reparations and all of that, just offering scholarships, discounts, whatever, depending on the situation for Black, Indigenous people of color, for people who've been hit really hard by the pandemic, because we all need a lot of help right now.
We all need support.
And one other thing that I'll mention, because I never talk about this, is I also do copywriting for healers, therapists, coaches, healers of all kinds. I love, because I have a marketing background and I love to write. And so that is the thing that I'm doing, and I'm getting more, the universe is like sending me more people. And so I'm really excited about that. So I have a copywriting page on my website you can check out too.
Thank you for sharing that, because, I'm sure everybody can relate to the fact that we don't need digital clutter in our inbox. And you're one of the only people that I'm still subscribed to, because you're such a fantastic writer. I mean, really, like you and I both know we don't have time to read everybody's stuff that comes in, especially when we're doing the same work. But you're such a fantastic writer. So I'm happy to hear that you're allowing yourself to creatively flow in that way. So
yes.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for being on the show. And if just in closing, is there any one little favorite quote or nugget of wisdom you'd like to share with the community?
I always come back to find your feet, find your breath. Because if we can just do those two things, we're going to be okay, whatever that means, no matter what.
Yeah. You're still here. It's just this moment.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you for being on the show. Thank you, friends and family, for listening in again this week. Aloha.